Color is really important, but so many people, including myself until very recently, kinda approach white balance a bit backwards. So if you default to 5600 Kelvin, like daylight balance for pretty much everything, or worse, you leave the camera on auto, listen up, because I think you're holding back your images and probably hurting your creativity. It definitely was for me, which is why I got this very difficult to find and outrageously expensive filter sent to me all the way from the Netherlands, but we'll talk about that later. Let me know if this sounds familiar. You either just turn on auto white balance, or you pull out like a gray card or your Sony body cap and use that to set your white balance so that it's correct. What's wrong with that? Exactly. Well, technically nothing, but if you turn on the creative juice machine for a second and think about it, also kind of everything. Let me show you what I mean with two examples. One of my favorite movies of all time is Guy Ritchie's Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, shot by Tim Morris Jones on 16mm film for a budget of £800,000. That's only $1.4 million. Or for a slightly bigger budget, another favorite, The Matrix, shot by Bill Pope for the Wachowskis for a slightly more expensive $63 million. But did you see it? Lock, Stock is yellow and The Matrix is green. Neither of them have correct white balance. The color is a really big part of the story that they're telling. And look, I'm well aware that color grading exists. It's a big part of my workflow when I'm making these videos. And I also know that the DOPs who shot those films didn't achieve that look in camera. But I don't agree with this Reddit commenter who said no DOP worth his salt would ever use color filters when shooting. When there is $60 million at stake, you have to be pretty sure of the look you're going for, but you and I aren't on the hook for that much cash, at least not yet. And one of the big advantages of being a smaller, leaner artist or creator is that we can afford to experiment more and try things out. And so instead of trying to achieve a technically perfect white balance in camera, I think you should achieve one that's fun. Because here's the thing, when you mess with your white balance to get a look in camera, it's not just that your photos or your video is going to have a color cast, it's that your eyes are now seeing in that color, and it's going to change the way you decide to compose your images. When I went out and did some nighttime street photography with the Nikon ZF, I had the most fun when I messed with the tint slider and made everything green. I was shooting raw photos, so if I wanted to in post, I could have reset the white balance back to absolutely clinically perfect without losing any quality whatsoever. But seeing with that green look and shooting with the intention in the back of my mind that I wanted it to be green made a really big difference. I know that it's really easy to get caught up in all of the technical stuff to do with image making, and there's a lot of it, but I think it's just as important to spend the time thinking about the artistic parts too. If you're shooting like a corporate tripod interview type of thing, then by all means get your gray card out and get a perfect white balance in camera. But if you're trying to make something interesting, get inspired, or you're just shooting for yourself, then why not mess with your colors in camera and see what happens? Make everything blue or super warm or really magenta. A big part of creativity is experimenting and discovering stuff that you didn't really think of before and you didn't know that you liked. Do you remember that clip of David Lynch getting really angry that he was only going to have 2 days to shoot a scene?
It just drives me nuts that we have to do it in 2 days. Somebody arbitrarily says you got to do it in 2 days. It's absolutely horrible. We never get any extra shots. We never get any time to experiment. We never get to, go dreamy or anything. We barely fucking make our days. I could have spent a week in the Fireman's. I love that place. And dream up all kinds of stuff.
See, I don't think that's because he needed more than 2 days to get it absolutely perfect. It's because he wanted longer to experiment, to play, and discover things he never would have thought of before. So, what's the deal with this filter? This is a 77mm Tiffen 85B filter, and yes, it was very expensive and hard to find in my corner of the planet. The reason that it's expensive and hard to find is mostly because they're not that useful anymore. You can find 85B filters like this one all over the place in charity shops and flea markets, but most of those are very little because they were designed for film era lenses. That's because the job of this filter is to convert daylight balanced light to tungsten balanced light. Motion picture film that they shoot movies on comes in either daylight or tungsten balance. Think of it as your camera's white balance, but you only have two options to choose from. If you're into film and you've ever shot Cinestill 800T during the day without this filter, you'll know what I mean. It kind of just looks really cold because it's designed to be shot under tungsten lights. If you've ever shot a petrol station on Cinestill 800T, I'm sorry that you were hurt. You should like and subscribe and we can get through this together. But if digital cameras let me set the white balance to whatever I want, why the hell did I get this filter? Remember experimenting? Well, a while back, I heard from a guy who knows a guy that someone had tried shooting daylight exteriors digitally with one of these with the camera set to a 3200 Kelvin white balance in an effort to emulate the look of when they did that with film. He thought that it worked and it looked kind of cinematic. It shifted the blues and the greens around, apparently. And admittedly, I really like a lot of films where they shot exteriors on tungsten film. Here's a few examples. I think it has this sort of rich, almost surreal look to it. It's very Hollywood coded, but I didn't really buy that this would work digitally. To be honest, I didn't have high hopes, so I ordered the filter and decided to try it out. The first tests that I did were not exactly scientific, but I did find some very interesting things. I shot them using the Sony FX30 and the Helios 44-2 and this filter, and obviously all of that and everything else that I use will be linked in the description if you're interested. Now, as you can see, it does change things, but I think that's mostly just because there's a lot of extra magenta coming into these shots. I like how they look, but it's not quite the result I was expecting. And that comes back to experimenting. I did not expect that I would really like that more magenta look. I tend to make my images really green a lot of the time. So now that I have that sort of vintagey, pinky, dreamy look, I have that extra tool at my disposal. I did another very unscientific test to figure out the magenta thing. I used the body cap of the FX30 and the white balance picker, and the camera said it needed the digital equivalent of a full green gel. So now that I've done that, we can try out the filter without that color cast and see if there's really a difference at all between normal daylight balance and tungsten balance through a filter. Because we're basically cutting out a whole load of blue light, I would assume that the blue channel of my sensor is going to be more underexposed than normal, which might lead to darker skies, but it might also create more noise in the shadows. But here's the thing, it's not just me that's wondered if this works. The man himself, Sir Roger Deakins, tested this out on film, and he found that it did make a difference in the shadows. He also apparently tested it digitally with an OG Alexa and didn't see as much of a difference. So let's see. I think there's a teeny difference, but if anything, it could just be that my exposure is very slightly different. The filter means that I have to give the camera an extra 2/3 of a stop of light, which I did with shutter angle and made it match the waveforms in post, but it might not be perfect. It would be really fun to try this out in a proper studio environment with a light meter, but I think the fun part is this. Because I experimented with something, I discovered that I really like using this filter for the magenta look it gives me in certain shots. And I discovered that I quite like shooting through this filter uncorrected, believe it or not. I think it looks a bit like Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. So whether you're doing street photography or making a short film, I think you should reevaluate how you approach white balance. It's one of the most powerful creative tools we have, so use it like one instead of trying to make it correct all the time without thinking about the mood or the vibe of what it is we're creating. If you'd like to see more of what I shot on the Nikon ZF, as well as my thoughts on the camera, watch this video where I'll show you. Stay hydrated and create art.